Hi everyone. In this presentation, we'll look at CLT, which deserves the title of Game Changer in Language Teaching Methodology. Since we are beginning with CLT, which was devised between 1960 and 1970, I think it would be appropriate to talk a little about what used to happen before that in order to make a connection of CLT with its predecessors. So as I talked earlier that these methodology or instructional designs were based on the theory of language and the theory of language learning. So before CLT, the language learning theory, which was quite popular, was behaviorism, which described language learning as a stimulus response process, and the theory of language, which was around, considered language as a set of rules to be learned and focused only on linguistic competence. However, from 1960s, the process of globalization started impacting on different sectors, especially travel, communication, and education. The world was becoming smaller and everyone was connected to each other. The need to have proficiency in English was becoming more urgent for many countries around the world. In reviewing the status of language teaching at that time, educators concluded that the teaching methods which were focusing on linguistic competence were not enabling learners to communicate with each other, despite the fact that they were able to translate books and read scholarly texts. These language users were unable to communicate orally. So the language teaching approach that came out as a result was CLT. Communicative language teaching took the shift away from linguistic competence to communicative competence. Linguistic competence is the command over language rules, whereas communicative competence is an umbrella term which includes linguistic competence, sociolinguistic competence, discourse competence, and strategic competence. Let's try and understand what these competencies entail. As for linguistic competence, it deals with all the components of language: grammatical knowledge, vocabulary knowledge, and phonological knowledge. Sociocultural knowledge deals with the appropriacy of language. What's appropriate in one situation can be inappropriate in another situation. So, for example, when we invite a friend to our wedding, we can say, "Buddy, I want you there." But we can't use the same to invite a teacher to our wedding. We'll have to be at least a little polite or less direct. The competence at discourse level includes the knowledge of rules that are beyond the sentence level. We normally teach grammar at the sentence level in the classroom, but as per CLT, we should teach whole texts together and see how grammar works beyond the level of sentence. As for strategic competence, it's the use of strategies which can be used to overcome linguistic knowledge so we can get communication going. For example, if a learner can't say, "It's against the law to park here," a learner can still maintain the conversation by saying, "This place you cannot park." So all these competencies are taken into account in communicative language teaching. So it takes the shift away from linguistic competence to communicative competence and draws on the interactive and learner-centered philosophies of second language acquisition. The focus of CLT is to develop communicative competence. So grammar is no longer the starting point. The starting point is various language functions which we use to communicate in the real world. Some of the functions are agreeing, disagreeing, complaining, requesting, suggesting, etc. So functional syllabi are designed so that teaching those would enable learners to effectively function in the real world. Real communication is the defining characteristic of CLT, as this code explains. Classroom activities should parallel the real world as closely as possible. Since the language is a tool of communication, methods and materials should concentrate on the message and not the medium. The purpose of reading should be same in class as they are in the real world. Since CLT is an approach, it is quite broad. On the same line of thought, a researcher named Stephen Krashen explained natural approach to language learning. He put forth 5 hypotheses which can be considered as the principles of CLT. The first is acquisition learning hypothesis, where he drew a line between acquisition and learning. Acquisition refers to an unconscious process that involves in the natural language proficiency through understanding language and using it for meaningful communication. However, learning refers to the development of language through conscious rules about language, which results in explicit knowledge about the forms of language. He draws a conclusion that much of a language is acquired and does not require conscious learning. The second hypothesis is the monitor hypothesis, which means that conscious learning can only function as a monitor of acquired language to fix any inaccuracies in the output. So for example, the language is acquired. Now conscious learning can help us fix the inaccuracies which are part of our acquired language. He also mentions some conditions which can help this system to function properly. They are sufficient time for choosing and applying a learned rule, that is practice. We need to focus on form for the output. We also need to focus on the knowledge of rules. The next hypothesis is very interesting, that is the natural order hypothesis. It states that grammatical structures are acquired in a similar manner even when learners' first languages are different. So an Arabic speaker and a Spanish speaker both acquire English grammar in a similar sequence. And this also resembles what we learned in the concept of universal grammar. So for example, this is the developmental sequence for questions in English. Learners acquire this step by step. So at stage 1, the learners only use single word for a question, like cookie, mommy book. At stage 2, they use declarative sentence with rising intonation to make a question. For example, you like this? At stage 3, fronting happens. They just put the auxiliary at the front to make a question. For example, are you happy? You will notice in the second example, the auxiliary is repeated again. So at this stage, they don't have a sense that there should be subject auxiliary inversion. They just put the auxiliary in the front and repeat it after the subject as well, like in is the teddy is happy, or do I can have a cookie. At stage 4, they learn this subject auxiliary inversion and use it correctly. Are you going to play with me? And they also learn that there needs to be an additional auxiliary if there isn't any, so they can make present simple questions as well. Do you like dogs? At stage 5, they are able to put the WH word and auxiliary together. So they can make questions with WH words like why did you do that? At stage 6, they can correctly form all types of questions, including negative embedded and complex ones. The next hypothesis is called the input hypothesis, which is quite valuable. This states that acquisition happens by understanding language input that is just beyond the current level of learners' understanding. He refers to it as I plus 1, which means input plus 1. The input should be slightly beyond learners' current level of understanding, not too difficult and not too easy. If you can recall, this principle has been drawn from the concept of ZPD, or zone of proximal development, that suggests that maximum learning happens in this zone. This hypothesis also stresses that fluency cannot be taught, rather it emerges over time through understanding input. The last hypothesis is the affective filter hypothesis, which deals with negative feelings associated with language learning. So affective filter actually allows or blocks the input which is necessary for acquisition. So the lower the affective filter, the better. So all these hypotheses act as guiding principles for selecting activities for the classroom. Let's quickly have a look at the implications of CLT for language teaching. As much as comprehensible input as possible must be provided through stories, listening texts, general reading, etc. Whatever helps comprehension is important, such as visual aids, pre-teaching vocabulary, etc. Language knowledge should be acquired through meaningful and communicative language use. The focus in the classroom should initially be on listening and reading. Speaking and writing should be allowed to emerge. In order to lower the affective filter, student work should be focused on meaningful communication than on forms, because students coming to language classes already have high affective filter. They already have performance anxiety. So the input should be interesting so it contributes to relaxed classroom atmosphere. At this stage, I hope you have sound understanding of the principles of CLT. Let's move on towards the tasks for delving deeper into this approach. Task 1 is related to a video lesson which demonstrates CLT principles in action. You need to watch the lesson and fill in the task sheet. Task 2 is to be done after the reading, which I have already uploaded, and you need to respond to the following questions after reading. I must reiterate that all the essential and optional resources have been provided through a link in the description of the first video of this series. I hope you enjoyed this lesson. I'll see you in the next lesson with the next approach, that is task-based language teaching.